city, school, hospital, community college. Add them all up, and that gives you what's called the consolidated rate, and that's kind of the bottom line for taxpayers. That's what's going to show up on your tax bill. All the different jurisdictions will be there broken out too, but the bottom line that you pay is going to be your consolidated rate times your taxable value. One last item on the rate here, and that is the difference between the tax rate or the levy rate and the effective rate. The levy rate is the consolidated rate that people pay. The state average is about $35. The effective rate is more like a sales tax. The effective rate is what are you paying in taxes divided by the market value of your property. Forget about taxable value, forget about productivity value for ag property. Just look at how much did you pay in taxes and what is the market value of your property. And that's your effective tax rate. For commercial property, since they're assessed on their market value and generally paid 100%, their effective tax rate is about 3.5%. For residential property, they're assessed at market value, but they're rolled back to about 44%, so their effective tax rate is about 1.6%. And then for ag property, they're assessed on productivity, which in the current year is about 25% of market value. So the effective tax rate on ag property is about 0.9%. So you hear a lot of chatter among legislators about how do we reduce the commercial property tax burden. We have high commercial property taxes in Iowa. And this, I think, shows that that's true. Because commercial properties really don't get any breaks in the property tax system. Now, they may get other breaks through TIF or through other taxes, but not in the property tax system. Okay, let's skip ahead a slide to levy and talk about the dollars real quickly. Let's go one more, actually, to that chart. This is going to show the total property taxes collected in 2008 by jurisdiction. I think maybe one more arrow click will bring that up there. Counties collected about $860 million, which is only about 21%. Small type on there. The jurisdiction that collects the most property taxes are schools, down to $1.7 billion. And then there are cities and a number of other smaller jurisdictions. But I think the next slide is more interesting. This compares property taxes to other taxes. If you look at 2008, on the next slide, please, there's about $3.9 billion in property tax collected in 2008. Compared to all these other state revenue sources, property taxes are far and away the biggest. In personal income tax, $3.4 billion, sales tax, $2 billion, gas tax, less than $500 million. I mean, property tax is the biggest revenue generator in government in the state of Iowa. And so that's maybe not surprising why it's also the tax that people like to hate more than any other tax. Why don't we skip ahead a little bit here to talk about TIF before we run out of time. It's the next slide right after this. And actually, we'll go to the next one. I'm sorry. So TIF, when I say TIF, I'm talking about tax increment financing. And this is a method that most often cities use to finance development or improvements in certain areas. TIF can be used by cities or counties. I think even community colleges have a limited way that they can use TIF. But TIF is used far more often by cities than by counties. And here's the way it works. Let's go through these 5 steps of how TIF works. A city or county is going to establish a TIF area in year 1. And as of right then, whatever the assessed value in that area is, that's the base value when this whole TIF district gets started. Then the next step is the city somehow gets some upfront money to make a bunch of improvements in the area. You know, maybe it's new streets or sewers or water lines or utilities or whatever needs to be done in that area. And that upfront money can be bonds. The city could issue debt. The city could do what's called rebate agreements, where the developer will front the cost and then the city agrees to pay the money back through property tax rebates. There's a lot of different ways that a city can get the upfront money. But they get the money, and then step 3 is they make improvements to the property, these new sewers or whatever the case may be. And those improvements make the area more desirable for development. Maybe it's a residential area, maybe it's a new office area, whatever the case may be. Once the new property comes in, it's going to increase the taxable value in that area. And so the increase over the base year is going to be called increment value. And then all the taxes paid on that increment, this is step 4, all the additional property taxes paid on that new value is used to pay back the developer if it was rebate agreements. It's used to retire the bonds if bonds were issued to use the upfront cost. Whatever the revenue source was, the increased property taxes are used to pay off that debt. And then step 5, once the taxes are collected and the debt's paid off, then the increment value is released. The TIF is kind of over, and all of a sudden, everything's back in the same, treated the same way again. It's all part of the same property. There's no new TIF. So this graph is kind of the idea of how TIF is supposed to work. That red kind of downward line is showing an area that was, maybe it's a blighted area, things aren't going real well. And to stop the valuation from continuing to decline, a city would set up a TIF at that dotted line. And then now that orange line, that flat line is frozen. That's the base value. And once the TIF does its thing and works, then that higher green line is going to be the increment value. That's the new valuation that came into the TIF area. Now TIF was originally only allowed for slum and blighted areas. Areas of a city that really weren't doing very well and that probably nothing was going to happen unless some kind of government intervention stepped in. But now, since 1995, TIF can also be used for economic development. And this is on the next slide. So economic development is pretty broadly defined, so you can use TIF for a wide variety of things. And it's been used quite a bit over the past 10 years especially. There was about $2.4 billion in TIF increment value 12 years ago. There's $8 billion today. And if we look at that, that's about an average of a 10% growth in TIF value per year compared to about 3% growth in the non-TIF value. And why does all this matter? Well, it matters because on the next slide, you've got that $8 billion in TIF value. None of that money is being used to fund general government operations. It's not going to schools, it's not going to counties, it's not even going to the city's general fund or operating budget. It's being used to retire the debt that was issued. Because of the school aid formula, the state government, has to kind of backfill the school districts and make them whole when they lose money to TIF. And TIF costs the state $43 million a year in backfilling that school aid funding. And it also means that if there were no TIF, if all the value was in the normal property tax base, tax rates could be lower. You could have the same amount of revenue generated for government operations with an average tax rate that's about $2 lower around the state. Now, on the next slide, the supporters of TIF would say that $8 billion that's locked up in the TIF increment right now, eventually it'll go back and be used for all the local governments. Eventually that'll happen. And furthermore, if we wouldn't have done the TIF in the first place, that $8 billion wouldn't even be there. That development wouldn't have happened, the new valuation wouldn't have occurred, and you'd be no worse off than you are right now with the TIF, because the TIF caused that development to happen. And that, I think, is the biggest dispute when you talk about TIF, is if the development would have happened anyway, then the city is just capturing all that property tax revenue that was going to be there anyway. If the development wouldn't have happened, then the TIF really did work. It really is a good tool to spur that development. And unfortunately, from my perspective, you're never going to be able to tell whether the development would have happened or not with or without the TIF. The last aspect, it's not really TIF, but it's somewhat related, and that's tax abatement. Now, the big difference here is that if you're a property owner in a TIF district, you're still paying property tax on your full value.